I'm not at Iowa, so there's a lot of jokes that go around in a pin too about Iowa's internet. So I'm really hoping that it holds up for the talk. But you can find me on my blog at trevan.co. I've been trying to write quite a bit this year, mainly CSS and front end things. And then of course on Twitter I'm at Trevan Hetzel, and then GitHub I'm Trevan Hetzel as well. Like Ralph mentioned, I work remotely for a pin too. My title there is visual design engineer, which basically means I'm a front-end developer with a focus on responsive web design. I spend most of my time writing HTML and CSS, but I still do a little design, and I'm kind of venturing off into the land of Node.js and front-end JavaScript frameworks like Angular and such. But mostly I focus on the front-end responsive sites, which is kind of giving me the opportunity to really force myself to push CSS to its limits. Kind of a goal of mine lately has been to try to create everything I can, like layout and functionality, in just plain CSS without having to rely on JavaScript. So that kind of brings me to the title of my talk, which is CSS can do that. As I mentioned, I've been fascinated with the extent to which you can really push CSS, just plain old CSS without any JavaScript. And there's a lot of things that most developers rely on JavaScript or jQuery for, but can be done without any JavaScript at all. So I'm going to walk through several real-life scenarios where you can use CSS in place of JavaScript today. And so I kind of, as I was preparing this talk, I kind of narrowed it down to one main thing that I found that's kind of the biggest thing in my eyes that's so cool about CSS, and that is that typically people use JavaScript and jQuery for things like click events, right? You click this button, do that, stuff like that, and a lot of people use jQuery for that to maybe toggle classes or use show and hide methods. So click events are obviously not natively supported by CSS, but with a little bit of hacking and some trickery, we can make that functionality appear like we have CSS click events. So throughout my talk, I'm going to mainly focus on that. But there's several other pretty advanced techniques along the way that we're going to use to kind of create the things that we're going to build today. So let's build something with CSS. Let's have some fun. I put together a little kind of a sample website just for us to kind of walk through, and there's some functionality pieces through this website that we will kind of break down. And so let's show that real quick. So here's just a super simple application or a little website. There's a few, 4 or 5 kind of things that actually work, I guess you could say. So over here on the left, we have a list of all the modern web speakers, but we're only showing 5, right? So we want to see more, so we click the More button, and looky there, right? There's the rest of them. And then if we click less, it slides it up, right? So it's just kind of a simple toggling, if you will. And then over here we've got some tabs. So we've got the main tab is bio, and then a talk, which is just kind of, there's nothing in there. I just put that on there to show what it does. And then also we have a mini off canvas. So we click that link and we get the off canvas that comes out, which obviously is a very common layout technique, especially on responsive sites for mobile devices. And then we have just a simple drop-down kind of show hide thing again. So there's several different ways that we can kind of recreate click events with CSS. Throughout the talk, I've kind of broken it down to the 2 that I think are the most useful and that we can really get the most use out of. And the first one that we're going to meet is the checkbox. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the checkbox hack. where you know, use the checkbox to style elements that are siblings of that checkbox. So that's what we're going to be breaking down first, and we can actually push the checkbox pretty far. A few things that make the checkbox so awesome and allow you to use it to create click events is, first of all, checkboxes and radios too, but we're just going to focus on the checkbox for this talk. They have a pseudo class called checked, and that checked pseudo class is really what we utilize to say, hey, when this is checked, do something. Just like a JavaScript toggling effect. And then checkboxes also have a corresponding label. So as long as a label's for attribute is equal to the ID of the input type of checkbox, you can click the label, and it'll toggle that checked pseudo class on and off, just because it corresponds directly with that input. And then finally, if we combine adjacent and general sibling selectors, which are the plus and the tilde, that is when we can really select elements other than just the checkbox. We can select the siblings, and that's when we can really make things happen with pure CSS. So I'm going to walk through this is going to be a super simple example of just styling a basic form checkbox. And the first thing you can see is just a simple input. You notice the ID is sample-checkbox, and then you'll notice that the label is the for attribute is sample-checkbox, which corresponds with the ID. Notice how the label comes after the input. We'll talk about that in a minute, but that was on purpose. So the first thing we're going to do is, you notice that the checkbox had a class of checkbox, just so we could style it. And we're hooking into that, and we're just telling it to not be shown. We're putting display none. So that's going to completely hide the checkbox, so you can't see it. But we're going to basically create our own checkbox using a before pseudo element. In this case, we'll use the pseudo element on the label. We'll set the content to just an empty string, and then just the rest of it is kind of styling stuff, floating it left and giving it a width and a height, and a border and border radius and whatnot. And so here's what that gives us, right? It looks like a checkbox, and the cool thing is, I just made this a super simple checkbox, but you can style that any way you want. Whereas styling checkboxes, like the native input element, it's kind of hard to get right cross-browser. So by utilizing the label, we can actually make them look consistent throughout different browsers. So obviously, if you click it, nothing happens. It's just a static pseudo element. Trying to press the arrow key. Okay, so we'll talk again real quick about the adjacent and general sibling selectors. So the adjacent sibling selector selects only the immediate sibling that follows the former specified element, and then the general sibling selector selects any sibling that follows the former specified element. So we can use that, and what we can do is we can say checkbox colon checked. So when the checkbox is checked, we can select the adjacent sibling, which is the label, and we're selecting the label, and then select the pseudo element of before, and we're just going to change the content. And we'll just use a basic HTML checkmark entity. But doing so gives us this. So we now have a functioning custom checkbox. So it's that simple to create, custom checkboxes with CSS. And obviously this isn't too earth-shattering, but the premise here is what we're going to be using throughout the next few techniques. And the first technique is, there we go, toggling content. Back to our demo. So I've removed everything except for what we're going to toggle. But we have this list over here, and clicking more shows more, clicking less obviously shows less. So that's a common thing that people might use JavaScript for, to say, hey, when you click that more button, add a class to a div that's hidden or something like that. Well, we're pretty much doing that, but there's no JavaScript. So if we look at the markup, I know this is kind of a lot to look at, but I'm not using an unordered list. Probably should be, but just for the sake of simplicity, I decided to just use a bunch of anchors. So we have a containing div that contains all of the anchors, and then we have our first 5 here that are shown by default. And then to break it up, we have an input, a checkbox input with an ID of show attendees, and then directly after that we have a label with the for attribute of show attendees, which is corresponds to the previous input. And then after that, a sibling, of course, to the input and the label, we have just a div with a class of all-attendees. And in this div is where all of the hidden items are. All right, so it's pretty straightforward markup. We will just kind of make it fancy first so that we can kind of see what we're actually doing. We'll start by setting display block on the anchors, which is they have the class of attendee there, and then just give them border bottom and some padding. And notice the height. I don't typically like to set heights, like explicit heights on things, but for this case we need to, and I'll show why in a few slides. But just know that we're basically going to have to come back and remember that value of what that height value was. And then obviously just a nice little hover, changing the background color on hover. So that gives us obviously this, right? So we have a list, but that kind of looks crappy with a checkbox in the middle and more right in the middle, right? That doesn't really make any sense, but we're getting somewhere. And so to actually make it work now that we've kind of styled it, first thing we're going to do is we're going to hide those items that are not shown. We're going to hide those initially, and remember they were wrapped in an all-attendees container. We're just going to set that to display none, right? And then we're going to hide the checkbox, which I actually have a commenting error here. But we're going to hide the checkbox like we did previously in the previous example. And then we're going to actually make the magic happen. So although the checkbox is hidden, its label is not. And remember, you can still, by clicking the label, you can still toggle on and off the checked pseudo class of the checkbox. So when the checkbox is checked, we're going to use the general sibling selector, and we're going to select that all attendees div because it is, it comes after it in the DOM, and we're just going to set it to display block. So if we do that, you can see that only 5 are shown, the rest are hidden, and clicking more shows the rest. Right? Now obviously there's a few things wrong with this still, but we can click more again and it'll hide. So that's cool. We have kind of a toggling effect. But the two things that we need to do now are, I don't think that you should have this more right in the middle of the list, right? That should probably come down to the bottom of the list, and it should probably say less. So that kind of makes sense, right? So to do that, to make it really work, we kind of have to use some positioning tricks. Remember that the div that encompassed this entire list, it had a class of attendees, and so we're just going to set that to have a position of relative, and that allows us to then go and set the label to position absolute. So it will be positioned absolute relative to the container that contains everything. And remember that height value, this is where it comes into play, because we want to set that label to the very, very bottom of the list. And so we're giving it a negative bottom value. of 3.3 ems. I think the value is probably a little bit different than what the height was, but that's just because we're using ems and we have to account for the font sizes. But then we will kind of style it some more with some padding and obviously the font size, and give it cursor pointers so it actually works like, or appears to be a link. And then the wording. Currently it's just a label, and that label has, it wraps the words more. Well, obviously when the rest of the items are shown, you don't want to say more, because that makes no sense. So I didn't show this with HTML, but we're basically going to remove that text from the HTML. So it's just an empty label, and we're going to set the content in a pseudo element to more, right? And then again with the checkbox hack, if you will, when the checkbox is checked, we're going to select that label, and it's before pseudo element. We're just going to change the content to less. So that gives us a nice toggling effect. More or less, right? And then this is, I just kind of added this. This is just a CSS, a pure CSS arrow, just to kind of show, hey, you can toggle this down or you can put it up, and that's done just by utilizing this border technique, setting the border left and right to transparent, and the border top to a solid color. And then as long as the width and height of that actual element are 0, that will create a pure CSS triangle. And then again with the pseudo elements, when the checkbox is checked, we're selecting using the adjacent sibling selector to select that label's after element, and we're just basically flipping the arrow, right? So that's all that is. So if we look at it now, we click more, and we scroll down, we have less now. We click that, and it's more. So now we have, a full kind of accordion style functionality here with pure CSS. Now obviously, sometimes you might want to, maybe the showing and the hiding is too abrupt, right? You'd like maybe a slide down effect, which is obviously pretty easy with jQuery. But with CSS, we could still do that. We just utilize CSS transitions. The only problem is you can't transition the display property. So we couldn't say, we couldn't put the transition on display or hide, or I'm sorry, display none and display block. We couldn't put the position on that. But what we could do is we could set a min height to that hidden div to 0, and put the transition on the actual min height property. And then when it's open, we just make that min height a lot bigger, and that would slide down real nice. But the only problem with that is you have to know the height. So that kind of stinks. But that stuff is, again, JavaScript is typically used for this, so we're kind of hacking CSS to make it work. But I mean, if you really wanted a slide down effect, you can make it happen as long as you kind of knew the height. So there's our first example of actually making something cool with CSS click events, right? So the next thing is we're going to go off canvas. Like I said, off canvas, we all see it on our mobile devices. When you click the little hamburger icon, a lot of times content slides over and it kind of pushes the content that was there off the page. Well, we can do that with CSS, and this is actually on my blog, on my personal blog, trevan.co. I'm using this same technique. So we can use it today in modern browsers, and even like IE9. So I went ahead and set up the tabs just for this example, so we can show, since the off canvas is inside of one of the tabs. But I'll go back and talk about that later. But for now, if we just look, we have this contact link with the hamburger icon, and clicking the icon slides over this content from the side of the page. And then clicking anywhere other than inside of here clicking anywhere other than actually inside of the off canvas here will close it, right? So that's what it's going to do, and this is how we're going to set it up. So marking it up requires a containing element. For this particular example, I decided not to use a ton of class names, just so it's kind of easier to see, what elements are actually doing what. So right now we just have a containing div, and then a input type of checkbox with a corresponding label, and that label is going to be our trigger, obviously. I just put in the word trigger. And then we have an element after that that is the actual off canvas. So that's where the actual stuff that is to slide over is going to live. And then after that, you have a section with a class of content, and that's just your main page contents. If this were, if we were doing this from the ground up, going mobile first, creating a site-wide off-canvas situation, everything inside your page, like your header, your footer, and all of that, that would go inside of this content element right here, so that it can get slidden off the page. So that's the basic structure, pretty straightforward. We're just going to set some base styles. Again, the containing element needs to be positioned relative. We set the width to 100%, and then overflow hidden. Overflow hidden, we need that because otherwise it won't appear that the content is like getting pushed off. It'll just it'll cover whatever content is to the left of it, and it would not look good. So that's what overflow hidden is for. And then our input, this is our checkbox again. We're just displaying it none, just hiding it from the view. And then the label, just giving it some very basic styles of float right, so it's to the right. And then we're setting a transition here. And we're transitioning the margin right. That we'll come back to that, but we're going to need that for it to kind of, for the label, which is like the hamburger icon, to slide over, right? And then the actual off-canvas element, we're positioning that absolute, making sure it's at the top of its container. And the trick here is we're setting a negative right value, and that value is equal to the width. So we're setting the width at 15 ems and the right value at negative 15 ems. And then we're just setting the height of 100%, so it covers the whole height of the containing element. And then set a background, and then a transition. And we're going to be transitioning the right value, because as we'll see in a minute, that right value is what's actually going to make it slide over. So then the actual content, so where like your header and your footer and all the content of the page would live, we're setting that to just have a width of 100%, and then we're also giving a transition of margin left there as well. So what we see is this, right? This is kind of a dumbed down version of the example I showed earlier, but clicking that trigger is going to slide over the off canvas, and it's going to slide out the normal page contents. So to actually make it work, you might guess we're going to use the checkbox hack again, and we're going to start by sliding the off canvas, the actual off canvas element. We're going to slide it to the left. We'll target the input. So when the input is checked, we're going to use the general sibling selector again to target off canvas, and we can do so because it comes after the checkbox in the DOM as a sibling. And what we're doing is we're just setting the right value to 0. So if you remember, it was completely hidden off to the right side. Well, when the input is checked, we're sliding it over. And since we had that transition, it's going to slide in real nice. And then also, since the input, since the label, which is our actual trigger is the label, since it's a sibling and it's not like inside off canvas, we also have to slide it over. Remember I had the transition on margin right. Well, right now when the input is checked, we're just setting the margin right to 15 ems, which is also equal to the width of the off canvas, so it kind of slides over nicely with it. And then finally, the rest of the page content, we're just giving it, when the input is checked, we're selecting it and just sliding it over to the left by giving it a negative margin left. And with that, when we click the trigger, bam, we have working off canvas. Right? You can select in here, obviously. You can select out here, but if you click the trigger, it's going to close it. So that's the the basis of off canvas. And then we're giving it a little bit of style. It looks like this, just different colors in the actual hamburger menu. Looks like that. But there's one issue, and that's, I'm calling it clicking off. A common functionality of off canvas is that when it's open, if you click anywhere on the page but in the actual off canvas element, it's going to close it, right? You see that a lot of times on mobile devices. You don't have to actually click the hamburger icon again to close it. You can just click anywhere and it'll close it. It looks kind of tricky, but it's actually pretty simple. We'll go back and look at the markup again, and there's only one extra element needed, and that's another label. So we now have two labels for that input with the ID of checkbox, which is hidden. But this one we're gonna give it a class of close so that we can style it. So that's all the only other thing we need in the markup. And then for that new label, we're going to set it to position absolute. Remember, this is positioned absolute to its container. And we're going to set the top to 0, the left to 0, and a width and a height of 100%. Okay, so that basically, we'll talk about the pointer events real quick, but without the pointer events, that just creates basically a hidden, like a ghost layer on top of everything. And with the way the z-index stack works, you wouldn't be able to click on anything but that. But if we set the pointer events to none, basically what that means is it allows it to really be like a ghost element, and you can like stick your hand through it. You can click through it to elements underneath it in the z-index stack. Now, pointer events none is not, it's a CSS3 property. So the browser support is not as good as just the typical checkbox hack. So if you have to support like IE 8 and 9, this isn't going to work. I mean, you can still have functional off canvas. You just won't be able to like close on click. So then what that does is, since it's inside of the container, it's going to be slid to the left, and then when that happens, when the input is actually checked, we're setting the pointer events to its default value of auto, and that allows you to now, if you click anywhere, since it's slid over with the rest of the content, if you click anywhere, it's going to activate that checked pseudo class. It's going to remove the checked pseudo class from the input, since this close element is a label, and it's going to close it. So it's going to act kind of as this closing off element, if you will, that anywhere you click other than off canvas will close it. So with that in place, if we click and as you can see, if you click out here, nothing happens, right? But if you click the hamburger icon, we have off canvas open, we can click in here, nothing happens. We can click out here, bam, closes it. And of course, we can still click the label because that, the pointer events will set to auto on the div that sets on top of the label. So that is how we create full functioning off canvas with pure CSS. Now, there's several other ways to do off canvas. This particular way, like I said, is the way I did it on my personal blog, and it's kind of the way I like. But again, there's several other ways, and well, here's the kind of the final again. But anyways, one of those ways is with the target pseudo element or pseudo selector. And I'm not going to cover off canvas with target, but target is kind of the next technique of creating CSS click events that I'm gonna cover. I mentioned there were two. There was the checkbox, which we covered, and now we're going to cover target. Target is a CSS3 property as well. So if you're worried about IE8 and even 9, I think you probably can't use target. But it allows us to do some really cool things. There's one major shortfall to target that I really don't like that we'll talk about. But first, let's kind of check it out and see what it does. So the target pseudo selector, pseudo class, is activated on an element when the URL hash is the same as an element's ID. Okay, so for an example, if we have this fake URL with a hash of modern web, if there is an element on that page that has an ID that is the same as that hash, we can use the target pseudo class to select it. So in this case, we could just change it, the color to yellow. And as soon as that hash, like if you were to delete that hash modern web from the browser or from the URL, then the target pseudo selector would no longer be active, and so then it would be back to whatever color it was by default. So that's the base of target. We're going to push this to its limits and do some really cool things with it. So going back to the toggling content example, we're going to toggle content again. This time, since we already did this sidebar with a checkbox, this time what I want to do is I want to cover this up here, this little button that when you click it, right, it toggles content. So it's kind of like a drop down, and clicking it again closes it. So again, it's super simple, but we're going to learn how to do it with target instead of a checkbox. Excuse me. The markup again is actually simpler than using an input of a checkbox. We're just setting an anchor that has an href of hash attend, and then there's a div that is a sibling of that anchor with an ID of attend. Okay, so that's super simple markup. And the cool thing is, it doesn't matter if this div is a sibling or not. It can be anywhere in the DOM. So with that, obviously we just get super basic. Got an anchor and content, does nothing. But to actually make it work, here's what we're going to do. We're just going to set it to, we're going to set the content to display none, and then we're going to set the attend, which is the content. We're going to set that element's target. So when its URL or when its ID is equal to the URL hash, we're going to set it to display block. So what that gives us is when we click the anchor is since its href is a certain a hash, that hash equals the ID of this div, so it's going to get display block, right? So just like that, we can show content, but that's not really a toggle. And you're right, it's just showing. But how do we actually show and hide? Well, welcome to the struggle bus. Sometimes target is not ideal for toggling. A lot of times I'd rather just use the checkbox technique for toggling, but we can do it. There's basically two ways to get around it. One, you could just provide a link to a different hash, because whenever you change the hash then in the URL, then the target pseudo class of the previous element is no longer going to be activated. You could do that, but you'd have to create like a new anchor, a new element to do that, and that would be, it wouldn't really be a toggle. It'd be like click this and then click another element to close it, Or two, we could style some stuff with crazy positioning and sibling selectors, and that is what we're going to do. So the markup is super simple though. I mean, we're just adding another anchor at the end. So that's straightforward. But then we're going to go, again, everything was in a wrapper. And this wrapper we're going to set to position relative so that everything is relative to it. And then that button, which is the original kind of trigger, we're just going to make it pretty. We're going to give it a width and a height, which is needed, the width and the height, and then just a background and color and stuff like that. And then the close, which is the new anchor that we just added, we're setting that to display none, and we're positioning it absolute in top and left of 0, and then we're giving it a width and a height of the same values that that button actually has. So it essentially, since it's positioned absolute, it just kind of sits right on top of that button. But since it's displayed none, clicking it, it's not going to do anything. However, when you click, so remember we had that button that has that href. When you click that button, it changes the URL, and then this attend, you can use the target pseudo class now. We're going to target using the adjacent sibling selector, this new close anchor, and we're going to set it to display block. Okay, so if we check that out, we have this button, right? And just kind of picture that hidden anchor sitting on top of it, but it doesn't actually get activated until we click. And now that hidden anchor is actually shown because we selected it with the sibling selector, so it's now shown. Clicking it again, toggles content. All right? So now we have kind of another way to toggle content with CSS. The downfall that I was talking about, the one thing I really don't like about Target, is that since it relies on a hash, let's say you're scrolled all the way to the top of the page. If you click this button, it's going to jump down. It's going to jump down so that that element that has that ID is at the top of the page. And unfortunately, there's really nothing that we can do about that without using some JavaScript. So it's kind of a downfall. In some cases, you can get over it, but other times, hey, you might have to use some JavaScript or just not use CSS for those cases if it really bugs you. So here it is again in our demo, and you notice the jump. Again, there's not really anything you can do, but there we go. We have now a toggling. So the next thing is tabs. This is probably the most extensive part of my talk, just because tabs are easy to create with the target pseudo selector, but they're really hard to get perfect to where you'd want to use them on like a live site. And I'll show why in a minute. But first, we'll check them out. We saw this at the beginning of the presentation where you just click. You have bio, talk, and other, and you click talk, and it toggles that. And click other, and all the while the anchors, kind of the buttons, are changing. They're getting like an active class, if you will. So there's what we're going to build. Marking it up. There are, if you just Google CSS tabs, there's several ways to mark it up. I like this way just because I like to have everything contained under one element, and so I start with an unordered list and just give it a class, and then for each pane and trigger is what I call them, they're under their own list items. So I have one list item, two list items, three list items. Under each list item, we have the anchor, which is the actual thing that's going to trigger it. And then we have the pane, which is where obviously the content is. So we have that, and then notice we have on each, whoa. Can you guys still see my screen?
It looks like it went back.
Sorry, it just like kicked me out of a full screen for some reason. Just a minute. Sorry about this. I don't know what happened.
Doug Niner.
There we were. Okay. All right, wow. Anyways, uh, this is the basic markup for this, obviously. Um, so we'll move on to the CSS. And we're just going to kind of make it pretty. So the containing element, we're going to set to position relative, set the list style to none, and margin and padding to 0, just so it doesn't look like a list. Then we're going to float left the list item, and then the tab trigger, which is the anchor inside of the list item, we're going to set it to display block, give it some padding, text line center, and a width. Now notice the explicit width again. Like I said, I don't like setting explicit widths, but to make tabs really work, we have to use a list or a width, and I'll show you why in a minute. But with that, here's what we have. Nothing works because all the content is shown, and it's not hooked up. But that's what it looks like. We're getting somewhere at least. Oops. Go. There we go. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set the pane, which is where the actual content lives. We're gonna hide it first of all, but then we're going to set it to position absolute, and we're going to give it a top of 4 ems. Basically, the top has to be enough to clear the height of the anchors. And then we're setting the left value to 0 and a width of 100%. What this does is it allows the 3 panes that we had to be positioned in the same spot. Even though they're all not shown at the same time, they're at least positioned in the same spot. So then all we do now is when the list item has the target pseudo selector activated, we select its child, which is pane, and we just set it to display block. So with that, here's what we get. Notice how nothing is shown by default, but if we click bio, we get the content for that. If we click talk, we get the content for the talk one, and other, we get the content for that one. So right now, this is sort of working. I mean, we have tabs. There's definitely some things that we need to work on though. So the first thing is a default state. You notice when we first loaded that up, there was no content shown. I mean, it was just blank. And this is where this kind of takes a little hack. It's not really something to be immensely proud of, but this is the best way that I found to make this work. What we're going to do is we're going to take that first list item that was up here, and we're going to move it to the very bottom of the list. Right? I know it sounds hacky, but just bear with me because this works. So you have your second tab and your third tab, and then you're technically the one you want shown first. That's going to be at the end. Okay, nothing else changes, just the order of the list items. And then here's where it gets kind of tricky to explain, but when the target pseudo class is activated on the list item, we're going to select the child, and that was just like it was before, right? That was what we had before, just clicking it displays block. But we're also tagging on, kind of piggybacking to that selector. We're selecting the last child, and then we're going to select its child, which is pane, and we're going to set that to display block. Now, if we just left it like that, that last child would be shown all the time, right? So then you'd have a double like it'd be fine when you loaded it up, but if you clicked on another tab, that tab's or that list item's content would be shown and be like overlapping the one that we just set the last child. So to get over that, we make use of the general sibling selector and say when this LI's target is activated, we're going to use the general sibling selector. We're going to select the last child and its child, which is pane, and we're going to display it none. So since it's the last in the DOM, anytime another tab is open, this one's going to get displayed. It's going to get hidden. So if we check that out, look, it's open by default now. And then if we click talk, well, that's content too, and that's not right either, is it? Because now they're out of order. right? Like the content, the first content is shown first, but bio correlates to that first content, and it's still at the last of the list of tabs up here. So we need to get around that, and here's what we'll do. Yeah, my butt slide, but right, we don't have an active class. Here's what we're going to do. We need to, again, remember when I said we need widths on the anchors. Here's why. Because we need to take that last one, since technically the first trigger is now last in the DOM. So we need to trigger that, or we need to select that by selecting the last list item, and then its child of tab trigger, and we're going to set its position to absolute, and we're going to position it to the left. But then we need to technically now select the second one, or that's what you're trying to select is the second one, but in reality it's the first one in the DOM. So we're going to target li colon first child, and we're going to set its tab trigger to have a margin left of 5ems, and that margin left is the same as the width of the rest of them. So now they're not in order in the DOM, but visually they're in order. So I know it's a hack, but it works. So if we check that out now, remember bio is the link to content 1, and it's active. Right? Clicking bio doesn't do anything because it's already active. Clicking talk changes to the second pane. Clicking other does as well. So now we have full functioning CSS tabs. Pretty cool. Again, a downfall of using target is the jumpiness. And if you can get over that, then target is awesome. But there's some tabs now. Active states. So let's talk real quick about getting the active states on the anchors. So when you click one, you want to know like basically which tab it is that you're on. So we do this it's very similar. I mean, it's like the same technique as the way we did the panes, the actual content panes. But this time we're just targeting the triggers. So we're saying, when the list item, when its target pseudo selector, pseudo class is activated, select its child tab trigger and set the font weight to bold, right? But then to get the default state, again, we're going to select the last child, the last list item, and select its child, which is tab trigger, and set it to font weight bold. And then again, to basically remove that from the last child when another one is clicked, we're using when a list item has target activated, we're using the general sibling selector to select the last child and then change it back to font weight norm. So if you had a lot of different styles, like if you're changing the color and the background and stuff like that, that you'd have to do it multiple times, which is kind of annoying, I know. But if you're using a preprocessor like Sass or less, you could easily just create a mixin for it. But with that, we now have our active class, right, with the font weight is now bold on bio because that's the first one. And then talk is also bold, others bold. So now we have active classes, if you will, or active states. And then again, here it is, finished. Full functioning tabs. You've got our off canvas that works, our little drop downs, and the more and less accordion style thing. So that's all I had for my talk. I could go on about the cool things you can do with CSS selectors. There's a lot more. You can kind of take this, both the input, the checkbox technique, and the target technique, and you can do a lot of stuff with it. So I hope you at least got something out of it and kind of can see how you can really push CSS to its limits. So
thanks, Trevan.
That was about 8 minutes left or so. If anybody has questions.
Great. Don had asked earlier when you're showcasing toggling content back and forth, what's the browser support for toggling content?
Thanks, Kramer.
Hey, Trevan, there was a question earlier when you're showcasing toggling content. Don had asked, what's the browser support for toggling content?
Well, just with the checkbox, it should go back all the way to IE8. I believe they select. I believe IE8 supports the check pseudo class. However, if you're using target, that is limited. I mean, I think target is supported in only IE11 and up, maybe 10. But yeah, um, if you really want support in like IE8, then you'd probably want to use the checkbox technique. So
Bob's saying there's a question about advantages, disadvantage of your solution for tab context versus using z-index. Let me scroll back here a little bit. I think Francois asked this question. Um,
yeah,
z-index could work if you had background color of white. Or wait.
yeah, yeah. No, I think I understand what he's saying, and you're right. I think that could work, which is fine. I guess just for this example, I decided to just use just displaying it, none, and hiding it. It's kind of simpler to explain than having to explain the z-index stack. So, yeah, that's another option.